The LC is a different kind of Lexus, extreme, aggressive and very desirable. It's a luxury GT coupe with a real sporting edge.
Lexus wants to change the way you think about it as a brand. How? Well, by delivering us cars like this one, the dramatic, desirable, high-performance LC Coupe. Remember this car. In future years, we think it'll be seen as the turning point from which Lexus became a more credible rival to the European premium makers. Not in terms of this model's sales importance, of course. It's very much a low-volume, niche market luxury product. A coupe like the company's existing RC model, but a size larger to better compete with GT segment contenders like the BMW 8 Series and the Porsche 911. Now that is a daunting brief, and one that you might think any Lexus would struggle with until you start to get to know this car. Now yes, the V8 version borrows its 5-litre engine from the brand's Manic RCF model, but there the carryovers end. Everything else that really matters here is completely new. That includes the stiff, sophisticated and relatively lightweight GAL architecture. Now, another thing you won't have seen before in the luxury GT segment is hybrid power. In this case, a 3.5-litre V6 unit of the non-plug-in variety for the LC 500H variant. It's hard not to be seduced by the V8 version that we're going to try here, though. That's an engine mated to the segment's first 10-speed auto gearbox and good for the kind of performance that might even worry a lower-order supercar. Perhaps that's predictable because the LC does itself have supercar genes, with much in its design shared with a model of that kind, the rare exotic Lexus LFA, which was hand-built by the brand in small numbers back in 2010. The LC rolls out of the same Motomaki Japanese factory and has much the same kind of exclusive feel. Will that be enough, though, to attract the conquest customers that the company's looking for here? Well, we're going to enjoy finding out. Start this V8 LC model up. And it sounds just the way you hope it might. Potent, powerful and emotive. It's enough to remind you that the Lexus brand has passion as well as luxury in its DNA. You'll already know that if you remember back to the time when Lexus made its own supercar. It was called the LFA, it cost £336,000, and back in 2010 it was manufactured by hand in a state-of-the-art Japanese factory at Motomaki by a carefully picked team of enthusiasts and craftsmen. Now today, many of the same people are making a more accessible sporting Lexus, this LC, and appropriately so, because this is a car whose very existence was made possible by that LFA. That model's chief engineer had a major say in the development of this one right from the start, hence the way that so much here is LFA derived. The driver's dash display, the optimum seating position, the carbon fibre roof that's fitted the sportier versions, and the fact that the battery is in the boot. That's one of a series of small but significant details that allow this car to replicate its supercar sister's almost ideal 52 to 48% front to rear weight distribution. The other thing that this LC shares with its model mentor is an insistent reliance on normally aspirated power. That's unusual in a world and a segment that's dominated by forced induction engines, and usually turbocharged ones. You don't, of course, get anything like the old LFA's 552 bhp 4.8-litre V10. I mean, that wouldn't be appropriate to this LC's humbler price point. Still, the 471 bhp 32-valve 5-litre V8 that this LC 500 model borrows from Lexus's smaller RCF coupe is more than up to the job of moving this car along very quickly indeed, storming to 62 miles an hour in 4.4 seconds en route to 168 mph. Inevitably, it lacks the torque that comes as part of turbo technology, but Lexus reckon you won't notice that thanks to the trick that this V8-powered LC has up its sleeve. That's the sector's very first 10-speed automatic gearbox. Now, the idea is that with so many gears, you simply won't notice the atmospheric 5-litre unit's relative lack of pulling power because of the way that the car compensates with such a closely stacked multitude of ratios. Now, we had our doubts about that before setting out on this test. After all, the more ratios you give an automatic gearbox, the more potential there is for cog swapping confusion, which is the last thing you want in a tactile, driver-orientated sporting car. In actual fact, though, our impression is that this paddle shift setup really works rather well. Now, essentially, it's a version of the 8-speed Sports Direct shift setup you get in the RCF, but with an extra top ratio for cruising and a further one inserted between second and third that gives you a bit of welcome extra punch when you're exiting tight corners on twisting back roads. Now, we should mention at this point that there's also an alternative LC model with a very different engine beneath the bonnet, and that too gets a 10-speed auto gearbox, although one that features even more sophisticated technology. Now, when you learn that the LC 500H variant in question is a hybrid and that its 3.5-litre V6 engine is, on the face of things, broadly similar to that used in the company's soft, syrupy RX luxury SUV, it'll be difficult not to suppress a groan if you're the sort of enthusiast who'd be so seduced by this conventional V8 model. But hold off on that for a minute while we tell you about the petrol-electric variant, because you may well end up warming to it. For a start, the V6 isn't quite the same unit used in the RX, having been redeveloped for high-performance use using what Lexus calls multi-stage hybrid technology. No, it is very clever and it's very difficult to explain in a few words, but we will try. So basically there are two transmissions in an LC 500H. Firstly, a belt-driven eCVT gearbox with 3 distinct gears, and that's the kind of thing that you would normally expect to find in a hybrid. Secondly though, and more uniquely, there's also a further so-called shift device. Now this is essentially a conventional cog-style 4-speed auto box. Now 3 of the 4 speeds of that shift device are used to amplify and multiply the basic trio of eCVT gears, thereby creating 9 virtual ratios. In addition to those, the 4th ratio of the shift device functions as a top overdrive motorway cruising gear, making a total of 10 speeds. Yeah, I told you it was complicated. Now, because there are so many ratios, there's less potential for the kind of hesitancy that you normally get with belt-driven CVT auto transmissions. And because the whole setup is underpinned by intelligent software, it's able to tailor itself to the way that you drive, taking into account the severity of your throttle and steering inputs to adjust the way that the various virtual gears are served up. That's why you'll probably be shocked by just how good an LC 500H is to drive and how fast and quick responding it is. Perhaps you shouldn't be. I mean, after all, this derivative doesn't lack grunt, with 354 bhp provided by the engine and a further 177 bhp delivered by the associated electric motor, which is powered by an 84-cell battery that, for the first time on a Toyota or Lexus hybrid, uses modern lithium-ion technology. All those braked horses are enough to ensure that the petrol-electric variant is only fractionally slower to 62 miles an hour than this V8 version. It takes just 4.7 seconds, which, to give you a bit of perspective, is faster than any V6-powered supercharged Jaguar F-Type can manage. Top speed is set at 155 miles an hour, and there's even a rather pleasing metallic-y V6y engine note to add a bit of atmosphere as the horizon scrolls towards you as if on fast forward. But of course, if it's aural fireworks you want, nothing but this 5-litre V8 variant will do, with the standard sound embellished by clever trickery through the stereo speakers. To hear it at its best, you have to twist this rather curious control on the left-hand corner of the instrument binnacle into Sport S mode, which, in the way that the setting systems do, sharpens the throttle response, the steering feel and the gear shift timings. Plus, ride quality too, courtesy of the standard AVS adaptive variable suspension setup. There's also a further, more extreme Sport S Plus mode, but that also disables a lot of the provided traction and stability support, which makes it rather more suited to racetrack use. There are 2 further drive mode select settings, Eco and Comfort, the latter mode being crucial if any credence is to be given to Lexus's insistence that this LC is primarily a sporting GT rather than a white-knuckle driver's car. or if it makes more sense, more of a BMW 8 Series and a Jaguar F-Type. In the event, it turns out actually to be somewhere in between. Even with the comfort setting dialed in, the LC simply doesn't have the smoothness of ride that you'd ideally want from a long-distance GT sporting coupe. The mandatory run-flat tyres don't help here either. At the other extreme, this Lexus is also a little too large and heavy to demonstrate the super responsive rack-to-rack agility that you get from a really focused, similarly priced out-and-out sports car like, say, a Porsche 911. Mind you, it is possible to get somewhere close to that if you specify your LC in the form that we have here and add in the extra cost Sport Plus package, which is available with both engines. Now this gives you 3 dynamic features that really complete the driving experience that the engineers were trying so hard to achieve here. There's variable ratio steering and rear wheel steering, along with a Torsen limited slip differential to help get the grip down through the corners. The rear wheel steering gives this car quicker turn-in through tighter, slower bends and a greater feeling of security and stability through the faster ones, which is where you might even feel the effect of the extra downforce that's generated by another Sport Plus package inclusion, an active rear spoiler which is deployed at over 50 miles an hour. It all adds up to a depth of dynamic potential that we've never previously seen on a mainstream Lexus model, sporting or otherwise. And it leaves you wondering whether that chosen middle ground between grand touring and proper sports car status might not in fact actually be quite a clever piece of positioning. In this LC 500 version, you don't get a chassis that's struggling to cope with the demands of the 5-litre V8, as is the case with the smaller RCF. And in both variants, every aspect of the car is feelsome enough to allow you to be as precise as you want to be when you're driving very quickly. Now that gives you confidence, as does the way that the chassis refuses to be distracted by cambers, by bumps, or even by over-ambitious throttle applications. It's a special combination, as you'd expect from a car so clearly developed by enthusiasts. The way this LC looks may be what draws you to it, but it could well be the way it drives that you'll really remember. Back in 2012 at the Detroit Auto Show, Lexus showed an eye-catching styling prototype, the LF-LC. Now, like most dramatic show concepts, it was never intended to be actually made, and it probably never would have been had not the company chairman, Akio Toyoda, chosen that particular period to go on a research trip to the US. As he journeyed around, he took every opportunity to ask Lexus owners what they thought of their cars, and they told him, boring, boring, boring. Now, chastened, Toyoda-san returned to Japan. He dragged the dust covers off the LF-LC prototype and, brushing all objections aside, told his top engineers and designers to bring it to life. Now, the result, wide, low, athletic and purposeful, sits before us now, hardly changed in form from the concept sketches. It's a new kind of Lexus, and as one American writer put it, you ain't gonna yawn. Well, what do you think of it? One way or another, you're going to have a reaction, and that is exactly what Lexus wants and needs after several decades of designs that almost nobody can remember. Now, we simply have to start with this shouty nose section and the way that it showcases the brand's signature chrome-framed spindle grille more effectively than any previous model. Now, as elsewhere, the detailing here is simply gorgeous, with a mesh finish that's tight near the lengthy bonnet but then loosens as it waterfalls down the nose. Now, replicating the concept car's super low bonnet line required months of painstaking suspension geometry redesign, while the extra short front overhangs required the introduction of these super slim LED headlights. It's in profile, though, that you get a better perspective for the real DNA of this design, with a swept-back roofline emphasised by chrome-plated side mouldings that amplify the elegant shape. Their rear edges fashioned to suggest the lines of a traditional Japanese sword. The blacked-out finish for the roof and the rear pillars combine to create a floating effect, while prominent front and rear wings flare away from the centre of the car and house large 20 or 21-inch wheels. It's more distinctive distinctive and exotic than anything you'll find from a European brand in this segment. And if you buy one, well, you can expect to make quite a stir. I mean, small children will drop their ice creams as you pass. Your boss will interrupt his conference call to stare as you park up. It is, in short, quite a piece of pavement theatre. Yes, even here at the back where the roof tapers down between the muscular wheel arches. Now you can see the spindle shaping from the front replicated here with these two creases that flow diagonally from the centre of the boot lid, following the edges of this number plate recess and then angling down towards the edges of this prominent lower diffuser. Now even the tail lamps are a work of art. They're composed of mirrors that create a multi-reflection three-dimensional sequence of L-shaped graphics. As usual though, what's more important is the stuff that you can't see, namely this car's stiff and sophisticated GAL, that's Global Architecture Luxury Platform, which is also developed for the 5th generation LS Saloon. It plays a crucial part in making this the most rigid, structurally advanced series production car that Lexus has ever made. Its structure's fashioned from a mix of several grades of steel, aluminium and carbon fibre reinforced plastic. Now, all this being the case, it would have been somewhat disappointing if, on the inside, Lexus had served up something more conventional. Now, fortunately, it hasn't done, and there's plenty to admire in a cabin that betrays painstaking design and even higher standards of fit and finish from the Motomaki Japanese factory. Slamming the door gives you a feel for the stiff superstructure. That action doesn't generate a hint of shudder from the surrounding bodywork. And talking of the doors, they're unusually trimmed. They feature what look like floating handles here, and they incorporate curving strakes that are supposed to represent a continuation of the exterior line that flows from the bonnet through the windscreen. These leather seats are absolutely superb, as they should be in any good GT, especially these lower set sports chairs that feature Alcantara and which come as standard above entry-level trim, and they're positioned to locate you as closely as possible to this coupe's centre of gravity. There's more unique design in the unusual instrument binnacle that you view through this three-spoke wheel, which, although it is a touch-over button, does feel great to hold. The gauges are based on those of the brand's old LFA supercar, with a central virtual rev counter and digital speedo dial that, on the press of this steering wheel button, slides sideways to the right to reveal another screen with trip computer, audio, safety and settings options. Plus there are plenty of other beautiful detailed touches, the hand-stitched gear knob for example, the equally tactile magnesium alloy paddle shifters, this unusual central cabin partitioner with its incorporated grab handle, and the discreet use of the Lexus L motif in areas like the face of the analog clock there, and even the tactile raised surfaces of the air vent controls. Perhaps inevitably, though, there are also design elements here that don't work quite so well. The horns sticking out of either side of the instrument binnacle, with settings for the driving mode on the left and traction control on the right, just look odd. And we simply don't understand why so many of the functions of the brand's standard Lexus Premium Navigation package have to work via this fiddly touchpad here down by the gear stick, which is much less intuitive to use than the simple circular dial you get with the rival BMW iDrive infotainment setup. Unfortunately, you do get a rotary controller and some proper buttons at the bottom of the centre stack to operate the audio system, and there's a proper CD player nearby. That's a feature becoming increasingly rare in modern cars. As for the other infotainment functions, well, accessing these via that maddening touchpad is for us still better than having to stab away at a touchscreen, as you would have to do in a rival Jaguar F-Type. The big 10.3-inch centre dash display you control via this pad deals with all the usual navigation, radio, media, Bluetooth phone and climate functions, plus it shows the rear view camera and the selected settings of the drive mode select system. As for cabin storage, well, apparently all the stowage areas are modelled on Japanese bonsai art. If that's the reason why the glove box and the door pockets are so small, then we could easily do without that. And it's a pity that there's no overhead compartment for your sunglasses. The central storage area between the seats does function a little unusually. Before you can lift its lid, you have to slide it back. In the process, you reveal a single cup holder. There's another one here at the bottom of the centre stack. When you do lift the lid, twin USB points and an aux-in port are revealed. So, time to try the rear. Now that's accessed via these long doors, which it may be a little hard to fully open in a cramped car park. That does at least help with access though, as does a one-touch walk-in function that activates when you pull this lever on the seat shoulder that slowly slides both the base and the backrest forward. Now as you get in, there's this neat little removable carpet mat on the floor, and there are two actually quite comfortable looking cocoon-like seats that don't have an armrest separating them because the space instead is taken up by a huge stereo speaker. Now unfortunately, the room on offer back here turns out to be horribly tight, which you kind of expect on a small, cheap coupe, but feel less inclined to forgive on a larger, more expensive one. I mean, legroom's extremely tight, and the sloping roofline means that even adults of quite normal height will have their necks uncomfortably cricked against the roof lining. Still, you do need to be fair. I mean, in a rival Jaguar F-Type, you don't get rear seats at all. And it's likely that the premium of space back here won't worry typical LC buyers one jot. People who, if they use these seats at all, will probably only press them into service for children or designer shopping bags. We certainly don't have an issue with that, but we are concerned by the lack of boot space, given this is supposed to be a GT that's capable of long-distance transcontinental motoring. Now, anticipating this problem, the designers decided right up front not to offer the option of any kind of spare wheel to try to maximise the trunk room that's on offer. Standard run-flat tyres are fitted instead. Now, despite that, once you lift the boot lid, which can only be done manually, there's just 197 litres of space available, and that's the best case scenario that assumes that you choose this LC 500 variant, go for the alternative LC 500H hybrid, and that figure falls to just 172 litres due to the fact that the petrol electric model has to package its hybrid system's lithium-ion battery pack back here too. To give you a bit of perspective, a segment rival like Jaguar's F-Type can offer over 300 litres, as can Porsche's 911 if you add its back and front stowage sections together. Now, the Lexus brand's supposedly smaller RC Coupe delivers nearly double the capacity on offer here, and that car offers 60/40 split folding seat backs to extend it. That's a feature that's not available in this case. Tabs for a couple of underfloor compartments promise extra cargo room below the trunk base, but you don't get it because this front area is taken up by the battery, and this one back here behind it is occupied by the jack. A third lidded underfloor storage compartment here does have a little room to offer, but the space available is so shallow that it would only be any good for items you'd recently run over. More useful are these short straps. There's one to the right of the boot lid there and one under the loading lip, which might help keep smaller items in place. There are two LC models on offer. This LC 500 version with its 471 bhp 5-litre V8 and the alternative LC 500H petrol-electric hybrid with its 295 bhp 3.5-litre V6, a variant that over half the buyers in our market choose. Both derivatives are priced identically at figures starting from around £77,000. Now, having made that choice, most buyers will want to embellish their chosen version, either with a sport package, which costs £4,000 extra, or with an even more luxurious Sport Plus package, the one we're trying here, which costs £9,300 more. Lexus says that most buyers of the hybrid version stick with the standard trim, while most who go for this V8 add in the Sport Plus package, which is pretty much what you'd expect. Discussing value is, of course, fairly relative when you're considering these kinds of sums, but likely buyers will still have one eye on the prices being asked for the other large luxury performance coupes in this segment that are also vying for their interest. And now there aren't any that can match the efficient petrol-electric powertrain of the LC 500h. So we will have to confine our comparisons to competitors that are pitched against the LC 500 V8 variant that we've been trying here. Probably the closest alternative is another relative newcomer in this class, the BMW 8 Series, which could easily cost you the same sort of money. Now, a more old-school choice in this category is Maserati's Gran Turismo, although one of those would cost about £7,000 more than this LC 500 V8, and it would deliver significantly less performance. Now, the other selections you could potentially make are a bit more tenuous in terms of representing a really direct comparison to what's on offer here. A Jaguar F-Type, not really. LC Money only buys you the top V6 variant of that with 70 brake horsepower less. The V8 version is way pricier and more powerful than this Japanese model, but certainly not more desirable. Plus, in an F-Type, you don't get this Lexus's useful back seats. As for a Porsche 911, well, LC Money here only buys you the entry-level 370 bhp Carrera version, so in comparison to this Lexus, you'll have to put up with 100 bhp less, although to be fair, that variant is virtually as quick as an LC 500. The Porsche is nothing like as well equipped as an LC though, and although it is a better track car and B-road blaster, it's an inferior long-distance GT. Are there direct Mercedes options? Well, not really. An SL 500 gets close to this LC 500 model's output, but it costs around £9,000 more, and of course, it's convertible. And worse, a fixed metal top convertible, which means it has to lug around a hefty set of roof panels. That doesn't exactly encourage agile handling. The other possible Mercedes model that you could put into the frame, the company's comparably powerful S560 Coupe, costs a cool £27,000 more than an LC, and it wouldn't see which way this Lexus went on a twisting country road. Otherwise, we're really struggling to suggest any other really direct comparable options for you to consider. A Nissan GT-R, well, you can't really imagine a typical Lexus customer considering one of those, although you could easily pay LC money for one. You could almost say the same about a Lotus Evora, which costs nearly as much as this Lexus, but it only has a 3.5-litre V6 that offers 70 bhp less. Now, a few years ago, a buyer in this segment of the market could just about have stretched to an Aston Martin Vantage, but that car has now been pitched well out of reach. It's nearly £50,000 more expensive in its latest form. Enough with the comparisons. We're going to assume that having done your homework, you've decided upon an LC, and if that's the case, then one of the reasons behind your decision is likely to be an expectation of a very complete standard specification. Now, if so, then by and large, you won't be disappointed. Full LED headlights and 20-inch cast alloy wheels both come as standard, as does the Lexus AVS adaptive variable suspension system and the Lexus Safety System Plus package that we'll cover off in a minute. More expected kit items include rear privacy glass, power folding mirrors, auto headlamps and wipers, and an alarm. Inside there's semi-aniline leather upholstery and front seats that are heated, ventilated and 12-way power adjustable with a memory setting. Features like dual-zone climate control, glass sunroof, aluminium sports pedals, an auto-dimming rear-view mirror and a heated steering wheel also come included. Plus, infotainment's taken care of by the Lexus Premium Navigation Package, which via a big 10.3-inch centre dash display gives you access to a Pioneer 12-speaker audio system, full European mapping, a DVD player, Bluetooth, a reversing camera and various connected services. Want more? Well, most LC customers will. The starting point for embellishment is the Sport Pack that primarily gives you larger 21-inch wheels and special sport seats trimmed in part Alcantara. Plus, at this level, you get a top finished in CFRP, carbon fibre reinforced plastic, although that means doing without the base variant sunroof, of course. If you have the funds to go further, then the Sport Pack Plus adds to this with a couple of significant dynamic features, dynamic rear steering and a Torsen limited slip differential to help you with traction through the bends. Plus, this top pack also includes carbon fibre scuff plates and a retractable rear spoiler. As for options across the range, well, there aren't many. The 13-speaker Mark Levinson's reference premium sound system could be tempting, as might the full-colour head-up display. And you'll probably want to pay extra for metallic paint, but that's about it. Refreshingly, Lexus doesn't copy its German rivals in offering an exhaustive list of extra cost features. You'll find most, if not all, of what you want in your chosen level of spec. On to safety stuff. Now, you'd expect a proper, large, luxury segment sports car to also go large when it comes to cutting-edge, camera-driven electronic safety features. And the LC does, courtesy of the standard inclusion of the brand's Lexus Safety System Plus Pack, which includes 8 key elements. Now, as you'd expect in this day and age, one of those is an autonomous braking system. Lexus calls it a pre-collision safety system, one of those that scans the road ahead as you drive in search of potential collision hazards. If one's detected, you'll be warned. If you don't respond, or perhaps you aren't able to, the brakes will automatically be applied to decrease the severity of any resulting accident. Now, this setup is also able to specifically identify people, and it will apply braking if a pedestrian is detected in front of your LC at speeds of between 19 and 50 miles an hour. The other 7 Lexus Safety System Plus features can be quickly covered. Advanced Lane Keep Assist warns dozy drivers who've drifted over the delineating lines on the highway and helps them back into lane. Sway Warning sounds an alert and displays a warning if steering input, lane positioning and vehicle sway suggest driver fatigue. Automatic High Beam automatically dips your headlights for you at night. Adaptive Cruise Control automatically keeps you a safe distance behind the car in front on the highway. And Traffic Sign Recognition pictures road signs on the move, displaying them on the dash. A blind spot monitor works on the move to stop you from dangerously pulling out to overtake in front of another car. And finally, a rear cross traffic alert system warns you of an approaching vehicle when you're reversing out of a parking space. As for more conventional safety kit fitted to all LC models, well, pretty much everything you'd expect is present and correct. So you can tick off a pedestrian-friendly bonnet, ISOFIX child seat fastenings, and no fewer than 8 airbags, twin front, side and curtain airbags, plus knee bags for both front seat passengers. On both variants, you'll also find a tyre pressure warning system and hill start assist control, which stops you from drifting backwards on uphill junctions. In addition, there are all the usual electronic driving aids for braking, traction and stability systems that in most other cars will only activate at the last minute if the situation demands it. In an LC, though, it's all done a bit more cleverly. The so-called Vehicle Dynamics Integration Management setup, coordinating everything together and taking action to correct the car just that little bit earlier. Rarely has a model been launched with 2 engines that are at such opposite ends of the efficiency spectrum. Half of all LC buyers will opt for the 5-litre normally aspirated V8 that we're trying here, one of the least economic power plants you could possibly choose in this segment. The figures here suggest a best case scenario of 24.6 miles per gallon on the combined cycle and 263 grams per kilometre of CO2. Now, for business buyers, that translates into a VED Band M and a hefty benefit-in-kind tax rate of 37%. The other half of LC customers, though, will be looking at a very different set of returns, courtesy of hybrid power, and that's something never previously seen in the luxury GT coupe sector. Okay, so this petrol-electric unit doesn't feature fashionable plug-in technology, but it's still pretty effective in terms of frugality and cleanliness, managing up to 44.1 mpg on the combined cycle and up to 145 grams per kilometre of CO2. Now that means VED Band H and a much more acceptable benefit-in-kind rate of 28%. So in other words, in terms of fuel and CO2 returns, the hybrid version of this exotic coupe would cost you about the same amount to run as an old Ford Fiesta ST. To put that figure into class perspective, let's say something comparable like a 3-litre supercharged Jaguar F-Type would use about 40% more fuel and would be about 35% dirtier at the exhaust pipe, yet it still wouldn't quite be able to match the performance of an LC 500H. Of course, during much of your urban motoring in that hybrid version, say when you're inching along in traffic with the engine seamlessly disabled and battery power in motion, you won't be emitting any emissions at all. Plus, it helps in this respect that cold weather operational efficiency has been improved with the brand's more recent hybrid technology. Now, that means that whereas previously a chilly morning might have seen the drive unit default straight to the petrol engine on startup, now it's much more likely to revert to the preferable electric mode as you glide out silently into the traffic. And that is a pretty cool sensation in a car of this kind. At higher speeds in an LC 500H, you'll need to bear in mind that the quoted fuel figures are even more heavily dependent than normal on the driver assuming a significant degree of restraint. And certainly to get anywhere near the 40 miles per gallon mark in day-to-day use with the hybrid version of this Lexus, you'll need to keep the car locked into the Drive Mode Select System's Eco Mode, which moderates the throttle response and the engine power output while tweaking the climate control too. You might also want to keep an eye on the useful graphical fuel consumption display, which is provided as part of the infotainment display's info section. There are trip info and past record screens, so you can gauge your ongoing success in fuel economy and energy regeneration. Actually, both LC variants get these displays, but if you're a potential buyer considering the conventionally engined version of this car, the V8 5-litre LC 500, you'll probably find it a touch painful to be looking at fuel readouts too often. To be fair, Lexus has done its best to maximise what's possible from this engine, claiming that for the LC it's optimised the exhaust layout and the engine control system. Plus, of course, there's that new 10-speed automatic transmission, which you'd think would use the engine revs more effectively. None of this, though, is really enough to make up the extra 200 kilos of weight that an LC carries around over Lexus's smaller but pretty much identically engined RCF Coupe model, which by the returns of that car, although they are still pretty poor, remain better than you get from this one. What else might you need to know about running cost issues? Well, buyers of the hybrid version will need to remember that petrol-electric Lexus models no longer qualify for free congestion charging. On the plus side, though, residual values do look pretty healthy, at least as good as those of the posh Teutonic brands. After 3 years and 30,000 miles, independent experts reckon that an LC 500H will still be worth 50.31% of what you originally paid for it, while for this LC 500 V8, the figure will be 51.47%. Remember too that when you're considering depreciation, an LC is better equipped than many of its German rivals. To match this car's spec, you'd have to spend extra cash on options with those cars, and that's money that you'd be unlikely to get back at resale time. Where Lexus could do better, though, is with the warranty it provides. Although there's a 5-year package to cover the hybrid engine, every other part of the LC package has to be covered by an unremarkable 3-year, 60,000-mile deal. And that doesn't seem overly generous in this day and age, particularly since parent company Toyota offers 5-year cover on its models. You can, of course, pay extra to extend this cover, but in our view, you really shouldn't have to. But does that matter? This is, after all, a Lexus, a car in which market experience suggests virtually nothing is ever likely to go wrong. The facts are that hybrid technology generates fewer warranty claims than conventional petrol or diesel engines do, and if something ever should happen, well, so charming and helpful are the award-winning dealers in the network that you may end up almost being glad that it did. That's probably just as well, given that you're going to be visiting them relatively often for routine maintenance. Servicing intervals every year or 10,000 miles for both engines are a little more frequent than we'd like, although a prepaid servicing plan can help keep the cost in check. At least the cost of those garage visits should be surprisingly low if you go for the LC 500H. That's thanks to the low maintenance requirements built into the hybrid Synergy drive system. Now, as part of this, there's no starter motor or alternator to go wrong, there are no drive belts to break, there's a maintenance-free timing chain, and there's no particulate filter to get clogged up with fumes. The hybrid setup has a good record for minimising tyre wear, and the battery will last the life of the car. Plus, the regenerative braking setup helps to extend the life of the brake pads. So let's finish with insurance, which isn't going to be cheap. With both engines, the standard model is rated at Group 48E, with the top Sport Plus variant up at Group 49E. But then you kind of expected that, didn't you? This LC, we're told, has been engineered for a new era. It's been styled that way too, and fashioned with a painstaking attention to detail that sets it apart, even amongst other desirable large coupes in its exclusive GT market segment. It is, without doubt, the most interesting car that Lexus has ever made. And it's what you get when you appoint a former chief designer rather than a conventional boardroom executive to lead a car company. Akio Toyoda assures us that from now on, the Lexus brand will be emotive and unique. And on this showing, well, you're tempted to believe him. Inevitably, we do have a few issues. The company says that this is supposed to be more of a sporting GT than a sports car, but if so, it should have a larger boot and give the driver the potential to select a softer quality of ride. For what it's worth, we think that underneath the GT pretensions, there's something of a sports car dying to assert itself. But you'll only really appreciate that if you pay an awful lot more for the Sport Plus package that we've been trying here, which gives you the variable rate steering, the limited slip differential, and the rear steering system that really completes what the engineers were trying to do here. In summary then, we're in no doubt that this is the kind of car that Lexus should be making. Something different in concept and execution to what's on offer from the European premium brands that the market's never quite conquered. Most people likely to buy one of these will probably decide to do so long before they get behind the wheel. This model does, after all, have that want one factor, as going forward, every Lexus should.